You're watching News 24 Live. The National Department of Transport is hoping to curb road deaths by compelling drivers to retake a practical test when renewing their driver's licenses. This is part of new draft regulations published in the Government Gazette, which also includes lower speed limits. To discuss this further, I'm joined in studio by Sipho Dube, who is the spokesperson for the MEC of Transport in the Western Cape. Sipho, thanks very much for coming in again.
Sure, a pleasure.
So the public reaction to these draft regulations has been quite immense. People are very irate. What have you guys made of this? And let me also just add that this includes, which we'll discuss later, banning of carrying children in bakkie loading bays. And then also what we have discussed previously on the show is the use of heavy vehicles or trucks during peak hours.
Well, the regulations have been published for public comment, so hopefully the outrage makes it to paper and is submitted as part of the public participation process. We will be doing the same. We will be submitting our comments on each of those regulations. Look, we do understand the impetus behind it. We have also lobbied for similar kinds of amendments in the past, or on various focuses on these particular issues, because we know it's a very serious problem, and it can only but assist if we tackle them in legislation and also through enforcement and education to reduce the number of people that die on our roads.
So do you agree with retaking a practical test? I'm assuming that's sort of like a learner's test, like your knowing your road signs and etc.
Yeah,
do
we
you
also
agree with going through that process again?
Look, we've also just received the regulations just a few days ago, so we are going to take the time to study them. Might be very premature to say whether or not we agree, but we are going to look at all the various facets to it. What we do know is that there is an issue nationally. We'd have to look very close at each province to really identify what that is, but nationally there is an issue with driver fitness, with the ability of drivers to be able to execute the duties that are required of them on the roads. And what discussions have identified previously are various interventions, such as the introduction of a probation period for new drivers. So all of those things will have to be looked at before you finally decide which course of action is ideal, and how those will work together to ensure that drivers are fitter on the roads.
Okay. And then talk of lower speed limits. What are they planning to reduce the speed limits by, and in which zones?
Yeah, well, in urban areas, the proposal suggests a reduction by 20%. So just standard urban speed limits are about 60 kilometers per hour. And the proposal is to reduce them to about 40 kilometers per hour. What we do know for sure, particularly here in the Western Cape from our statistical information, is that a lot of our pedestrian deaths, or pedestrians are being knocked over in those zones, in 60 kilometer per hour zones. So it's widely accepted that the 60 kilometer per hour isn't necessarily the safest for urban areas, particularly around schools and malls. That's where we know people get knocked over the most, particularly also outside of the highways. One would think it would be the highways where people get knocked over the most, but it's illegal to be on a highway, and it's not illegal to be on public roads or urban roads. So we have seen a lot of people being knocked over in those areas, and certainly a review of the speed limits in those areas is definitely necessary. What that should take, we are still going to study further and figure out exactly what we think would be ideal for the current situations.
Okay. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the banning of carrying children in the back of bakkies. I mean, that has been a huge cause of road fatalities. So that's a good thing.
It is quite big in terms of the safety of children. It has been in recent times with some incidences, very serious incidences. Again, that also needs to be looked at quite closely, exactly what then would be the ideal situations for transporting of children, because we do live in a situation where lots of children have to travel various distances to get to schools. So we do have to look very closely at how exactly would be the best way to do so before we can either accept or reject a proposal.
Okay, so essentially there are a lot of pros and cons.
There are. Arguably, and you've seen public sentiment have pulled out quite a lot of the cons, and we've seen them. There have been some very serious crashes involving children, but there are ways in which we can make scholar transport safer, and we are doing those currently. We're inspecting the vehicles. We have identified that some of the causes of these crashes have been things like vehicle fitness or drivers not being appropriately licensed, or not having the necessary authority to execute that function. So they actually should not be carrying anybody, whether it be children or people in the back of vehicles. We've seen that in the past, and we are identifying those issues directly through enforcement and various other means. But yeah, we'd have to look at the bigger picture holistically. The ideal situations that children wouldn't have to be transported in that way. Ideally, you should be able to walk across the street to your school, but we don't live in that kind of climate, and we need to look at what would be the ideal and the best situation for the transportation, particularly of children.
So do you think that these new regulations are, proposed regulations are practical? Is this not again another sort of knee-jerk kind of reaction, treating the symptom and not the cause on our roads?
Yeah, there've been arguments to that, but it's definitely necessary at various points in time for lawmakers to review legislation to see if they are, because the time in which they were made might not necessarily be appropriate for a different time. So it's definitely necessary. These exercises are important. That's why we have this 4-week period to submit these comments and for them to be considered properly and take into consideration, also very important in lawmaking, as international best practices. Look around all over the world, and we're lucky to have best practices around the world as to what is effective in particular conditions and what is not effective. So hopefully in this 4-week period we will get a wide range of comments from various stakeholders and those that are interested, and we will also be studying the regulations properly to submit our comments, and the end product should be a workable piece of legislation.
Excellent, thank you.
Sure, thank you.